You've been trying to understand it, haven't you? Not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. You did what you knew was right. You prayed. You waited. You showed up with a sincere heart. And still, things closed instead of opening. People turned cold without explanation. Opportunities disappeared without warning. Decisions were made that left you standing on the outside, wondering how everything shifted so suddenly. What made it harder was not just the loss, it was the silence that followed. No clarity, no apology, no clear reason. Just a quiet sense that something about the outcome didn't match the effort you gave or the faith you carried. If you felt that, you're not imagining it, and you're not weak for questioning it. Even some of the most faithful people in Scripture reached moments where the path stopped making sense. David was anointed king and then hunted like a criminal. Joseph was given dreams and then sold, imprisoned, and forgotten. They weren't confused because they lacked faith. They were confused because what unfolded didn't look like God's promise. And that's the part many people never talk about. Sometimes the most unsettling seasons are not caused by disobedience, but by an unseen decision that temporarily moved things out of alignment. You may not have known it at the time, but something was decided without your voice in the room. A conclusion was drawn about you. An assumption was made. A judgment passed. It could have come through people, systems, authority figures, or circumstances that held power over the outcome. And once it happened, everything downstream changed. The tone shifted. The timeline broke. What should have flowed became resisted. What should have been simple became heavy. And because you didn't know where the break occurred, you carried the weight inward, wondering if you were the problem. That's often how unseen verdicts work. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with explanation. They simply alter the direction of things and leave you to deal with the confusion. You replay conversations in your mind. You question your own discernment. You ask God quietly, "Did I miss something?" But the truth is, not every closed door is a correction. Some are pauses caused by decisions that were never meant to be final. And the reason it felt unfair is because it was incomplete. What made this season especially difficult is that you couldn't fight it. You couldn't argue your case. You couldn't prove your heart. The more you tried to explain, the less it seemed to matter. So you did the only thing you could do. You stayed silent and carried it alone. On the outside, you kept moving. On the inside, you felt suspended, as if your life was waiting for a correction that hadn't arrived yet. That kind of waiting can wear down even strong faith. Not because you stopped believing in God, but because you didn't understand why He would allow something that felt so misaligned with truth. But Scripture shows us something important about moments like this. There are times when God allows a temporary ruling to stand, not because it is right, but because it exposes what needs to be revealed. Jesus stood silent while accusations were made against Him. Not because they were true, but because the silence itself was part of the process. There are seasons where God does not immediately intervene, not to abandon you, but to let the limitation surface fully so it can later be overturned with clarity and authority. If you felt blocked without explanation, delayed without reason, or rejected without cause, it's because the issue was never your worth. It was the verdict placed over your situation. And that verdict did not originate in heaven. It originated in misunderstanding, fear, bias, timing, or incomplete vision. That's why nothing you did could fix it. That's why striving only made you tired. You weren't meant to correct it. You were meant to survive it. And here's the part you need to hear clearly. Just because something was decided does not mean it was settled. Just because a conclusion was reached does not mean it was eternal. God is not threatened by temporary rulings, and He is not limited by human judgment. He allows seasons to unfold not to confuse His children, but to prepare them for what happens when truth finally speaks. The discomfort you felt was not a sign that God left. It was a sign that the story was paused, not finished. You didn't fall behind. You didn't miss your moment. You didn't lose your calling. You were simply living under the weight of something that was never meant to define you. And the reason your spirit hasn't given up, even when your mind was exhausted, is because deep down you knew something was off. Not broken, not over, just unresolved. This isn't the end of your story, but it is the part where you stop blaming yourself for what never belonged to you in the first place. What you couldn't see during that season is that heaven was never absent. God was not observing from a distance, and he was not unsure about the outcome. The delay was not confusion in heaven, it was permission with boundaries. Scripture shows us again and again that God sometimes allows decisions to stand temporarily, not because he agrees with them, but because he is working within a higher order of justice. There is a difference between allowance and approval. God allows what he intends to later overrule, and he does so with precision. Think about Job. A verdict was spoken over his life, but it did not originate with God. Yet God allowed it to proceed within limits. Not because Job was wrong, but because something deeper was being established, not just restoration, but authority. What looks like loss on earth often becomes legal ground in the spirit. God permits the trial so that when he intervenes, the reversal carries weight, clarity, and permanence. Quick rescues feel good, but strategic reversals change destinies. This is where many people misunderstand God's timing. They think silence means absence or delay means denial. But God operates as a righteous judge, not a reactive responder. He waits until the moment when intervention cannot be questioned or undone. When he steps in, it is not emotional, it is lawful. Scripture says that the Lord sits enthroned as judge forever. That means every decision made against you must eventually pass through his court, and not everything that passes through is upheld. What was spoken over you? What was decided without you? What shifted your path? It all reached a point where heaven took notice. God does not ignore injustice, especially when it touches those he has set apart. But instead of rushing, he prepares. He allows the situation to mature, to expose its own flaws, to reveal the truth beneath the surface. That's why things had to play out longer than you wanted. The delay wasn't about punishment, it was about proof. When God reverses something, he doesn't simply undo it, he rewrites it. He turns what was used to limit you into evidence that elevates you. Joseph wasn't pulled out of prison the moment he was falsely accused. He remained until the timing aligned, not just for his freedom, but for his positioning. When the reversal came, it didn't return him to where he was. It placed him higher than anyone who judged him. That is how God restores his chosen ones. He doesn't bring them back to the same level. He establishes them above the verdict. You need to understand this clearly. No human decision has final authority over your life. No spiritual opposition can override what God has ordained. Scripture tells us that no weapon formed against you shall prosper. But it doesn't say the weapon won't be formed. It says it won't have the final word. God allows the formation so he can demonstrate his supremacy over it. That's not weakness. That's dominion. And the reversal you're approaching is not random. It's not rushed. It's not based on emotion. It's intentional, legal, and timed. Heaven does nothing out of order. Every delay has been aligning witnesses, circumstances, and clarity. When God moves, it will be undeniable, not because it's loud, but because it makes sense in a way nothing else ever did. What confused you before will suddenly feel precise. This is where your identity matters. Not everyone goes through this kind of process. Chosen ones are not managed casually. They are trained through tension. They are refined under pressure. God allows more resistance in their path because he is building spiritual authority, not just comfort. If he rescued you too early, you would have been spared pain, but you would have missed positioning. And God is far more interested in who you become than what you escape. You weren't overlooked. You were being prepared for something that required credibility. Heaven does not elevate people it hasn't tested, and the very decision that slowed you down is the same one that qualified you. That's why you're still standing. That's why your faith didn't collapse, even when your understanding did. That's why you felt stretched but not destroyed. God was preserving you for the moment when his voice would override every other voice. Now the confusion is giving way to anticipation, not because you suddenly see everything clearly, but because your spirit recognizes alignment. There is a quiet shift happening. Not chaos order, not panic positioning. What once felt blocked is loosening. What once felt heavy is lifting, not because circumstances changed overnight, but because heaven has already ruled. God never lost control. Not for a moment. He was never reacting to the situation, he was orchestrating the reversal. And when it unfolds, it will not just restore what was delayed, it will confirm who you are. You were chosen not to be protected from trials, but to emerge from them with authority. And what comes next will prove that the decision made against you never stood a chance of being final. What happens next may not look dramatic at first, and that's important to understand. When God rewrites a story, he doesn't always announce it with noise. Often, the first sign of reversal happens inside you. The weight you carried begins to lift without explanation. The urgency to prove yourself fades. The questions that once kept you awake lose their grip. You don't suddenly have all the answers, but you gain something more stabilizing: peace. Not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from trust. That internal shift is not emotional relief, it is alignment. It is your spirit responding to a decision that has already been made in heaven. As that peace settles, external changes follow, but they come in measured ways. Conversations shift. Doors that felt sealed no longer resist. People who once held influence over your outcome lose their authority, sometimes quietly, sometimes without realizing it. You may not need to fight or explain. Situations begin to correct themselves. That is how you recognize a divine reversal. It doesn't require force. It flows. What once demanded striving now unfolds with order. This is not coincidence, it is correction. However, not everyone will understand what is happening, and some will misinterpret it. There will be those who remember you only by the version of you that struggled, waited, or was overlooked. When the narrative changes, it can unsettle them. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your elevation challenges the conclusions they once made. Resist the temptation to explain yourself. God does not require your defense. The same authority that reversed the decision will also guard the outcome. This is a season where obedience matters more than urgency. You may feel a pull to move quickly, to make up for lost time, to reclaim what was delayed. But wisdom will ask you to move deliberately. When God restores, he also reorders. Some things will not return in the same form, and that is intentional. Not everything that was lost is meant to be recovered exactly as it was. Some things were removed to make space for what fits who you are becoming. Trust that God knows the difference. Patience here is not passive. It is active faith. It is choosing to stay aligned even when the momentum increases. It is resisting old patterns of striving, proving, and overextending. The temptation will be to step ahead of God now that things feel open. But remember, the same hand that closed certain doors is the one guiding the timing of the new ones. Stay attentive, stay prayerful, stay grounded. Acceleration without direction can create new delays. You may also notice a change in how you relate to people. Certain connections will feel complete, even if nothing negative happened. Others will naturally fall away as your focus shifts. This is not loss, it is alignment. God often rewrites a story by adjusting the cast. He removes voices that no longer match the chapter you are entering. Let this happen without guilt. Obedience sometimes means releasing what once felt familiar. The most important thing to remember is that this season is not about proving anything. It is about becoming established. When God reverses a verdict, he doesn't rush the result. He stabilizes it. He ensures that what he restores cannot be easily shaken. That is why the pace may feel slower than expected, even as things improve. Stability is part of the blessing. You don't need to announce what God is doing. You don't need to seek validation. You don't need to replay the past or relive the injustice. The rewrite is already in motion. Your role now is to remain faithful, obedient, and present. Do what is in front of you. Honor God in the small steps. Let him handle the outcome. There will come a moment when you realize you are no longer bracing for impact. You're no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're simply walking forward with clarity and calm. That is how you know the reversal is complete. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer unsettled. You can rest now. Not because everything has happened yet, but because the authority over your life has been reaffirmed. What was decided against you has been corrected. What was delayed is being reordered. This isn't emotional reassurance, it's spiritual law. God has taken responsibility for your story, and He does not fail to finish what He begins.